the other side, and he understands and gives grace to the fact that there's going to be a diversity of interpretation.
All true. In terms of this argument, though, this is an example. I think it's a case, and I think it's true of Hayes generally, is that he's, in the end, he's biblicistic. That is, he makes his arguments from the Bible without considering
External
other sources. Right. So, and he probably could, if he were here, to defend himself against that. He'd probably make a great argument.
So again,
But I'm just using this as an illustration, right? That he doesn't really take account of the question of the fetus, ontological status.
Right.
And he could say, I posit the fetus is a person, and I believe the fetus has a soul, and that's just, you can't go behind that. I simply posit that as a moral conviction that I can't defend any further. But it's smuggled into the argument here, I think, without him acknowledging it. So that's why it's problematic, right? Because it's not addressed. Yes?
Could you clarify that when late moderns say the word person, are they talking about the same thing as people who wrote scripture?
Oh, well, the word person doesn't even show up, does it?
Right.
Yeah, that's another very important point. And let's leap here to look at page, look at page 13, page 14. This is under the historical cultural gap between then and now. Top of page 14, organizing and mediating categories. I think these are always important in the way in which we reason from Scripture. Sometimes they're acknowledged, usually they are not. They're found often unacknowledged in very sophisticated arguments from Scripture. Let's look at just a few examples. There are our categories that are used all the time in talking about Scripture in the moral vein. The marginalized. There's no concept of the marginalized in Scripture. We can say there are the marginalized, right? We use our category and we say there they are. I agree with that. I use the expression all the time in class. But it's not a concept used by biblical writers. There's no word for it. And as far as I can tell, it's not a category that's operative. Human rights, also not in the modern sense, also not within the conceptual frameworks of ancient people. There are analogous ideas, but they are in the realm of duties and authority, which configures them differently. Culture. Ancient people had no notion of culture in the modern sense. Modern definition of culture is an integral symbol system by which any given part has its meaning in relation to the other parts. So that when you compare one culture to another culture, you have to be very cautious about the translation, right? Because something that's this in one culture could be a completely different thing in another culture. Any of you ever see the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy? I think it was about a Coke bottle. It was actually a bottle. But, right, it came from the Western world, maybe on a plane from New York or London. It drops down somewhere in Africa, and it starts on a journey. And in every culture it goes through, it becomes something else. You know, because it can be a tool, it can become this, it can be, maybe, you know, it was viewed as a gift from the gods and therefore having power. I can't remember it all. I just remember it became something different everywhere it went. So this is not anything in a kind of essentialist way. Ancient people knew that different peoples were different, right? They had different mores, different cultural, I don't want to use the word cultural here, different practices, but they understood this on a continuum of difference, not in terms of cultural difference. And that makes a big difference in how we conceptualize cultural difference in antiquity. We don't find ancients talking about in our terms. Well, others, ethnocentrism. Ancient people were ethnocentric, but they didn't have that as a category. Ideology. Today, most biblical scholars are very aware of these two, ethnocentrism and ideology, and these words are showing up in commentaries to describe things that are going on, say, in Romans or in the Gospels. And I think they are very useful categories to use, but sometimes they're used in ways that suggest the biblical authors themselves are using these concepts. That Paul is against ideology, and that's what he's trying to attack and expose in Romans 1 or in Romans 7 or wherever it might be. And I think that's preposterous, to put it that way. There's no concept of ideology in the first century. How can Paul be using it as a critical category? Now, he could be doing something very important that we can then configure in our conceptual frameworks in ways that aid our thinking about ideological critique of formations, social formations in antiquity. So I'm not saying it has no place in those discussions. It certainly does. But ancient people didn't have that concept. Or the concept of systems, even sexuality is an abstract concept, much less capitalism or socialism and so on. And then there's categories we imagine that we share with the biblical writers, but which they understand so differently that they may be apples and oranges in this, how we use them and how they use them. This is much harder to see because we tend to use translation terms, and because we read in translation, and even if we read in the original language as we translate, it's hard to see this unless you do some reconstruction. But words like the self, there really is exactly a word for the self in ancient Greek, let's say. There are words that stand for the self. There are reflective pronouns that refer to the self. Nature. We use this word, this concept, very differently from how ancient words by which we translate it were used. Freedom, divorce, the poor. I think we take these to all be patently the same thing when we read them in our Bibles, translated into English or Korean or Spanish. They're not the same thing. And in scholarship, there are debates about exactly how to understand the words behind these translation terms, and even debate about whether to use the word divorce when translated in the New Testament, because there isn't any word for divorce in the text, and what's described using verbs and so forth maybe not well communicated if we use this abstract term divorce as a translation term. Okay? So that's just to say, is there anything like the person in the modern sense in antiquity? No. Certainly not the modern individuated person who thinks of him or herself as, I'm talking really here about the modern Western individuated person, probably especially the individuated male of the mid-20th century who thought of himself as being really inside, the inner person, right? That the real me is the me inside, and that the public me, these are, this is what I show of myself to others. These are roles that I fill, and I can fill many roles. And this becomes only accentuated in so-called post-modernity or late modernity, where the real self is the inner self, unique, capable of being self-actualized. And then that unique self can move into any kinds of environments, and in terms of role, be any number of things. And this may be expressed for us in imagining my life course would have taken a completely different direction if I hadn't studied New Testament in graduate school and ended up at Garrett. What if I decided to be a musician or a baseball player? Or what if I had moved to another country and grown up? What if my parents had moved when I was such and such an age and I'd grown up somewhere else? Or what if this, what if that, of that? And I would have had a completely different identity. Because the modern person is aware of historical change, dramatic historical change, of dramatic cultural difference, it's possible for us to think of really being a different person in the social role if we were in a different time and place and environment. Even though we probably tend to think that the real us, the one inside, would be playing all those roles. And we think of that little us inside as having these potentials that need to be actualized and fulfilled. I think this is so foreign to how ancient persons thought. Or most medieval persons who didn't travel more than, 400 yards from home if they lived out in the countryside where it was dangerous to go out on the road. If you lived in the ancient world, you were born into a role. Your environment gave you a role. Few people moved out of those roles. You thought the roles were part of nature. They were stable. You didn't have a strong sense of any difference between your role and yourself. You did know that you could hide things from other people for strategic reasons, right? That you might lie to someone for your advantage. There's the internal secrets and the outward. But the person, if I can use that word, is in the social role. That's the real you. The mother, the father, and although there's some changing of roles, the changing of roles is the real person evolving. There is obviously it's hard to conduct any kind of psychology of ancient people, but as far as we can judge from the way they talk about themselves and about the world, the self seems to be social. And this is why, if you read ancient literature, novels, there are ancient novels and stories, all the action takes place in the external world, right? All the interest of the story takes place in action, in the world. And there's very little of, if any, of the internal landscape. Whereas the modern novel, which represents this modern self, is completely different. Tremendous inner landscape, right? And if you read the modern novel of the 19th and 20th century, especially if it is focused on private life of an individual, let's say, or a group, you want to be, as a Western modern person, you want to be drawn into that inner landscape, to know how that person felt, and be given a transcript of how they were feeling at each moment as they moved along. And the external events are part of the environment that makes all the inner landscape meaningful. I think in antiquity it was just the other way around. So this does have huge consequences for how we think about ethics, how we construct the person as a moral agent. So, okay, well that was a great, it was fun for me to go off on that excursus there. We're just about out of time. Should I give you one example of a good argument, since I promised we would end there? So let's see. We're back on page. I was giving you problematic arguments, and I gave you some more. On page 9, perhaps all good uses tend to be those that appeal to the most general level of scriptural values. Because it's so hard to get from then to here, now, right? And if you move from the very specific, you face the challenge of all those cultural translations that virtually always fall apart. So, I think that makes it difficult to show in a few sentences what a good argument is from Scripture, because it takes a lot, if we're talking about argument, right? It takes a lot of reflection and showing, and not just one text. So I will conclude, though I said on a more positive note. If you turn to page 15, this is really where I have ended up after the book that you read, Theology, Scripture, and Moral Debate, which is, I understand, is a kind of sociological description of how people make arguments. But some reviewers have thought that I was arguing that these are my rules that I adopt. I gave some presentations on this when I was writing the book, and at an Acts New Testament meeting, and Sarah Tanzer, a Jewish scholar at McCormick, said at the end, he says the use of these rules sounds just like what people do when they already know what they think, and they're just trying to rationalize, right? Rationalize their moral positions. And when Scripture isn't agreeing with what they want it to say, they find some way to make it say it. And I agree with her. I had the same sense when I was done writing the book, that an awful lot of that was going on. So this is why I think I end up here. A model of formed by keeping company with Scripture, a model of ethical decision making in which formed mature persons who know how to draw on multiple sources, experience, tradition, cultural knowledge, make wise judgments. And a personal or communal history with Scripture is essential as a part of their formation, but they do not base their judgments on Scripture through any direct hermeneutical arguments. And I want to quote from Wayne Booth, who wrote a book, he's a literary critic. He wrote a book called The Company We Keep, An Ethics of Fiction. There was a time wherein Western university education, the reason you studied literature, French literature, English literature, whatever it might be, was because it was edifying. It gave you culture, improved your culture, and it improved you morally. And that came under attack in the latter part of the 20th century. And Wayne Booth takes all those attacks seriously, but then he tries to rehabilitate some sense of the moral, edifying reason for studying literature. And I think one could apply this paragraph I'm going to read to you also to Scripture and why we read Scripture, how Scripture can form us, even if we're not arguing from it. But maybe if we are talking about it and struggling with it and debating, okay, but not making chains of argument from it. Booth says about literature, you lead me. He speaks to it as in dialogue. You, literature, lead me first to practice ways of living that are more profound, more sensitive, more intense, and in a curious way, more fully generous than I am likely to meet anywhere else in the world. You correct my faults, rebuke my insensitivities, you mold me into patterns of longing and fulfillment that make my ordinary dreams seem petty and absurd. You finally show what life can be, not just to a coterie, a saved and saving remnant looking down on the fools and slobs and knaves, but to anyone who is willing to work to earn the title of equal and true friend. So I think people are shaped by a lifelong occupation with Scripture in these ways. They're very hard to define, and they're probably more important than arguments from Scripture, which almost all are quite fallacious or highly problematic, even though, and I end with this confession, I will probably continue to make them.
Well, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
All right, we'll reconvene at 7 minutes past the hour.